Okay, so this is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And these are just my notes. I use the sticker thing, like the tabs. I think they're called tabs to like mark important passages. And then like I use like post-its when I'm writing something long. Because I just don't like bunny earing them. I don't like, because I think it feels like I'm destroying the book or something. Anyway, the reason I wanted to read this was because Jordan Peterson mentions this a lot. He created a list of like 15 books that most influenced him, and it's on like his website, and this was one of them, and he mentions it a lot in his lectures. So I wanted to check it out, and I just really like this topic, like meaning. The title is really gripping. Man's Search for Meaning. After reading this, you can really see the influence that it had on Peterson and like his thinking. The idea of meaning being the base instinct that all humans like yearn for. That's basically came from here. And also Peterson says a lot that you shouldn't overestimate your capability of good, because when put into certain situations you might not be as good as you think you are. And that also comes from here, because there's this one thing Viktor Frankl said in this book, was that and that was that the best of us didn't make it out. And that just like it's so striking, because it's true, and he had to admit that to himself, because you have to, in the concentration camps, you have to steal people's food, their bread, and when your name is on the list for the next people to die, you might have to cross it out and put someone else's name. And the people that are kind, they just didn't make it out because they were taken advantage of. So this book is split into two parts. The first part, it doesn't have any chapters. Basically 2 chapters, but they're not even called chapters in here. The first part is like 90 pages, I think. It's about his experience in the concentration camps. And then the second part is about his theory, logotherapy. And so, yeah. So a little bit about Frankl's early life is, so he knew he wanted to be, apparently, I'm getting this from like online, so I'm not sure how accurate this is, but he wanted to be he knew he wanted to be a psychologist when he was 3 years old, I think. And when he was in high school, the man, he wrote this paper and then sent it, I think it was about like the meaning of life, I think. And he sent a letter to Sigmund Freud, attaching his paper to it, and then Freud was so impressed that he actually published the paper for the psychoanalytic there's some organization, but yeah. So Frankl basically had his paper published while he was in high school, which is just crazy. And then I think he and Freud corresponded afterwards, and then I think Freud taught him a lot. But the thing with Frankl is, as he learned more and more, he kind of grew apart from Freud. Like, kind of like this, I think the same as Jung, but I'm not too sure about what happened there because I'm not read up on it. But Frankl started creating his own theory, which later he termed logotherapy. And the word logotherapy comes from the Greek word logos, which he defines as meaning. So it's literally therapy through meaning. And he criticizes Freud and psychoanalysis a few times, I think like 3 or 4 times in this book. And yeah, but he never like insults it. It's just he disagrees with what psychoanalysis tries to do, which is look into the past. And he's more interested in people's futures, trying to improve it that way. Yeah, so after he, I think when he was around 30, somewhere in his 30s, he wanted to, which is when he started developing his theory about logotherapy. He wanted to move to America to continue his studies and his research. And I think he got his visa, and he could have just gone to America, but that would mean that his parents and his wife couldn't come because the visa was only for himself. And so if he went, he would have had to leave them behind. And as like World War II was getting started, he didn't know if that was a good idea. And so he was like torn between like continuing his research, which can help a bunch of like people, or staying behind for his wife and his parents' sake. And I think his wife was pregnant too at the time. So he was torn between the two choices, and he just wanted like a sign that told him what to do. And that's kind of exactly what happened. So there was like this synagogue near his house that collapsed, and his father picked up like a stone from there to bring back for the family, just to remember it. And it turned out to be one of the stones from the Ten Commandments, with like one of the Ten Commandments written on it. And when Frankl saw it, it said, I think it was the fifth commandment, which said, honor thy father and thy mother, or something like that. And I mean, he just took that as a sign, and he stayed. So he decided to stay and take care of them, and they all ended up getting put into the concentration camps. And everyone but Frankl died. His parents, his wife, who was pregnant. I think they made her get an abortion when she entered the camps. So yeah, it's just... So the first part of this book was his experiences in the concentration camp, and it's like an autobiographical account of his experience. And he says right from the start, so the first part of this book was his experiences in the concentration camps, and he was at Auschwitz, but he got moved around quite a bit. I think he ended up being at like 4 different camps in his time there. And it's just like the first part is just like an autobiographical account of his experiences, and he prefaces it by saying like not to take his experience and like generalize it to all the other camps. His like experiences were in the smaller, like the horrors that happen in the smaller camps that the other books don't usually cover. The other books usually cover what happened in Auschwitz, which is like the big camp. Like if you ever read Night by Elie Wiesel, that book talks about like the horrors that happened. I think it was Auschwitz, that book, but I forgot. But it talks about like the horrors and like the terrible things that happen in the concentration camps, and like what other people are capable of. But this book, he makes an emphasis to point out the good that people are capable of. He does show the bad, but he also shows the good. And this is I'm quoting him, where he says, "After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer on his lips." So yeah, it's like both the evil that man is capable of and the tremendous courage and good that they're capable of also. Then this is other quote where he says, "The best of us didn't make it out," and that's just like so striking to me, because people had to steal each other's food, and if your name was on the list to die next, to like be put in the gas chambers or the crematorium, then you would have to, the only way you would survive is if you crossed out your name and put someone else's name on there. And like the guards, they didn't really care who was, well, he says that the guards didn't really care as long as the number quota was met, as long as the number quota was met. So people like fought over it. And if you're compassionate and selfless, then you probably weren't going to make it out, because people would take advantage of that. And that's just to admit that too, because he had to admit that he was not a good person, and that he had to do some of those things to get out. And also the camp life basically promoted aggressive and selfish behavior and evil, because the 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 prisoners that were the most aggressive were promoted to being capos, which capos or capos, I'm not sure. I'll just call it capos, uh, who uh, who would just get all the food, more food, and a comfortable life. So, and he said sometimes they had a more comfortable life inside the camp than they would have if they were outside the camp, while like the other prisoners are starving and like sleeping, like 20 of them on top of each other. And so it kind of bred aggressiveness and selfishness, because even if you became a capo, if you started being less aggressive than one of the prisoners, then you would lose your promotion and be put back into like the lower levels, where you get like watery soup and like no bread basically. And by promoting like the prisoners themselves, it almost allowed the prisoners to run themselves. It was all, which is similar to the Stanford prison experiments that my teacher talked about in psychology class. It's just like really sad part where he so you would get like tokens for certain things that you did, and then those tokens would be given to you, and then you can exchange those tokens for cigarettes, and then you can exchange those cigarettes with the capos for extra food, or I think every cigarette you get like a bowl of soup. And so it was basically only the capos that it ended up being, so that only the capos were the ones that were actually smoking, because they had enough food, they didn't really care. And you would prioritize hunger over the cigarettes. But he said you could always tell when someone gave up, because you would see them smoking their own cigarettes, which meant that they've given up and they just want to enjoy their last few moments and few like days or however long they survive without their food, which is just really sad. Well, this one time he was in the camp, and they were all sleeping, and then he noticed one of his like fellow prisoners was like shaking around in in their sleep. So he was obviously having like a nightmare, and he was about to wake them up. And then as he was about to wake him up, and then right before he realized like he was about to like do something terrible, and because no matter whatever nightmare he was having, it's better than reality, and so he stopped himself. And that was just and like going back to the part where there was this other time when he saw this like man that he knew to be like brave and manly, I guess. That wasn't the word he used, but I'll just use it. One and they had to walk a lot in the camps, and so everyone's feet got swollen, and this one man's feet got so swollen that his shoe couldn't fit, and so he had to walk barefoot in the snow. And then he started crying and sobbing like a child, and Frankl just said at that moment he just took out his bread and started eating it, because he found that entertaining, which I think people can relate to that. It's like if you're in school and you see someone who failed their test and they're crying, like you would stare at them and you would, or whatever facial expression you're showing, I bet deep down you're finding it entertaining because it takes your mind off class. Prisoners also found like moments of beauty and meaning. Like he described how like sometimes when they would be working, the sun would be setting in like the perfect angle against the leaves of the tree to create like this like glowing effect and like a long shadow, and they would just like take off and I'll like stare at it. If you ever saw Shawshank Redemption, I forgot his name, but the main character's name, but when he went into the guard's room and he played like the music on the radio, and then everyone just like dropped what they were doing and they just stared into the sky. Even just to like hear like beauty that they haven't experienced in so long. Like, that's what I imagine they felt like in the concentration camps.
I have no idea to this day what those two Italian ladies were singing about. Truth is, I don't want to know. Some things are best left unsaid. I like to think they were singing about something so beautiful it can't be expressed in words, and makes your heart ache because of it. I tell you, those voices soared, higher and farther than anybody in a great place dares to dream. It was like some beautiful bird flapped into our drab little cage and made those walls dissolve away. And for the briefest of moments, every last man at Shawshank felt free.
The second part of the book was like really interesting. Like I wanted to like tab every single page because there was like something new that I hadn't thought of, or something that I haven't thought of in a certain way, like every page. But so it's about logotherapy. This is where he describes what logotherapy is in a nutshell. And so he says psychoanalysis focuses on so he like critiques psychoanalysis a bit when he says psychoanalysis focuses on the patient's past and like repressed memories and stuff, while logotherapy tries to focus on the patient's future and trying to make them have see a better future for themselves that they can strive to. And so like another criticism he has of Freud's thinking is, I think he said that Freud believed, I might be mixing this up, but he said Freud believed that when a man has everything taken away from him and is left with his base state, basically through starvation or whatever, he will basically homogenize with the other humans and be like the same as everyone would be the same, because that hunger would take over, and that instinct of hunger and the animalistic those animalistic instincts and of hunger and whatever would take over. But clearly from what he saw in the concentration camps, that isn't true, because people were kind. We who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms: to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And he's like, good thing Freud didn't have to figure it out from personal experience. So he's like kind of dishing on Freud. And another so this is referring back to his criticism of Freud about people being like the same when they're like deep down. So he says, I consider it a dangerous misconception of mental hygiene to assume that what man needs in the first place is equilibrium, or as it is called in biology, homeostasis, i.e. a tensionless state. What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. What he needs is not the discharge of tension at any cost, but the call of a potential meaning waiting to be fulfilled by him. And basically, that's criticizing psychoanalysis, because I think the psychoanalytic theory is that people have trauma or repressed memories, and those need to be fully realized so that they can be overcome, which would bring them to the homeostasis. as Frankl says. Yeah, that's his argument against that. And again, I'm not that read up on psychoanalysis, so I might be wrong. And so he then describes like the meaning crisis, which was a term that Jordan Peterson came up with, but I think, but again, this is where you see his influence on Jordan Peterson. Like, he says depression, he describes how the modern man is in need of meaning, like, more than anything else. And he says, and then he describes how the existentialism like comes up. And he says, like, depression and a meaningless life, he says it arises from existential frustration, which is when you can't justify your own existence to yourself, or when you're having trouble justifying your own existence to yourself, which basically means you can't find a meaning to your life, like there's no purpose, and that leads to an existential vacuum, which is basically a meaningless life. And then that obviously leads to depression and suicide. And he worked with the depressed and suicidal patients a lot after he came out of the concentration camps. And this wasn't in the book, but I read somewhere that he always started the counseling by asking why that person isn't committing suicide, and then whatever that the person's response is, he would start there, because that's the one thing, the meaningful thing that's keeping them alive, that's keeping them from committing suicide. So I just found that interesting. Yeah. So when people get into the existential vacuum, or like depressed, he says they try to fill that void with like the will to power or the will to pleasure. And he said the most common will to power is like will to money, to try and fill the emptiness in their life. And also the will to pleasure, so yeah. And with the will to pleasure, like when you're in that state of depression and like meaninglessness, he said your brain tries to like gravitate towards instant pleasure, because that's the only kind of pleasure you can, like, since you don't see a meaning in your life, you're not gonna get long-term pleasure. So I guess that's why your mind tends to gravitate towards instant gratification. And like with our generation, I know so many people that like spend 10 hours a day on TikTok, which can lead to even more depression, because it doesn't do anything for you other than give you that instant like satisfaction. And also, if you ever seen like TV shows where when a character is depressed, they go on like a bunch of one night stands to try and fill like the void, but it just doesn't do anything for them. It just makes sometimes it just makes it worse, because you realize that that's not going to help you either. So he also talked about this one time when someone asked him what is the meaning of life, and he just calls it stupid. Like, he just calls that a stupid question. And I agree with him, because asking a psychologist what the meaning of life is the same as asking a chess master what the best move of all time is. And because you can't just pick one move and say it's the best move no matter what, because that's just not true. It depends on the situation, if you're in like the mid game, early game, whatever. Each situation has like a different move that you can use, and depending on like who you're playing against. And the same applies to humans. Like, each person finds meaning in different things. Like if you're a musician, you might find music very meaningful more than others. And like Viktor Frankl believes that every person has like their own meaning, has their own calling in their life that is unique to themselves, that will give them meaning. And each person, and in different situations, different things will be meaningful. Yeah. And so like the better question is, like, instead of asking what is the meaning of life, the better question is, what is the meaning in your life? Like, what do you find meaningful, and to just pursue that as far as you can. And he also there's this, he said there should the United States should have a statue of responsibility on the west coast to supplement the Statue of Liberty, because liberty by itself can just be arbitrary if there's no responsibility. And yeah, this also you see the influence on Jordan Peterson because he is also always advocating taking responsibility on your for your own life and the meaning in your life. And so he says there's three different areas in your life where you can find meaning. Where you can discover meaning, I guess. And he says the first is through your job or what you do, which is pretty self-explanatory. The second is through love, like loving another person. And the third is kind of hard to explain. It's in suffering. And so, okay, I'll describe the second one first. So finding meaning in love is basically, he said, finding a meaning in life by experiencing something, such as goodness, truth, and beauty, by experiencing nature and culture, or last but not least, by experiencing another human being in his very uniqueness, by loving him. Something else he wrote about love, which I found profound, is, for the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth, that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. The third way of finding meaning is through suffering. So like if you can bear the suffering of life through with like your head held high and not falter, you can find meaning in that. Because
pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse.
So an example that he gives is better to explain it with an example. So the example he gives is he once had a patient whose wife died, and he's like miserable, sad, and then so Frankl just asks him, if it had been the other way around, if you died and your wife was still alive, how do you think your wife would fare? And then how do you think your wife would do? And he said that she would probably be crying too and suffering like the way he is. Then Frankl told him, see, by having it this way, you're able to bear the suffering and sadness and sorrow, so that your wife didn't have to. And then from then on, when he switched his mindset to that, he found a meaning to his suffering, basically, that he can suffer so that his wife didn't have to go through something like that. And if you ever seen One Piece, if you ever read One Piece, like the anime, when Zoro was took all the pain, when Kuma like took all the pain out of Luffy, and then Zoro just like plunged into it, and like by the end he was just like standing like that, like bleeding out of every orifice in his body. And then when Sanji asked him what happened, he just said. And lastly, an example is, if you watch the movie Clouds, which was based off a real person, Zach Sobiak, like when he was, I think, 15, he was young, he was a teen. He found out that he has terminal cancer. Well, he had cancer for a long time, but he found out he was terminal. And so he spent the last few months that he had making music. And while everyone around him was crying, he was like this source of joy for everyone else. And so even when you're suffering, you can find meaning by taking it head on and not allowing it and finding meaning in it, you know? And lastly, he discusses super meaning, which he describes with an analogy. So within his analogy, he uses gorillas, but I'm just going to use lab rats because it's just easier to understand. So if there were lab rats, he said, do you think that lab rats would understand the meaning of their of all the testing we do on them, all the horrible things we do to them? Do you think that they would understand the meaning behind all their suffering? And obviously no, right? And so he asks us, do you think you can understand the meaning to your suffering in your life? And like the higher meaning, you know, like the meaning to the lab rats suffering is so they can help human beings thrive, and to help human beings survive, right? And so he says there's no way to understand the higher meaning, like the meta meaning to your life, because it's just not conceived. And this reminded me of this, like this thing that Neil deGrasse Tyson once said, that
chimpanzees 99.5% identical DNA does.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
What a difference that 1% makes. We have civilization. And the smartest chimpanzee can stack boxes to reach a banana. Our toddlers can figure that out. Maybe the difference between the human and the chimpanzee at the 1% DNA is the same small difference as between stacking boxes to reach a banana and the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, imagine a life form, an alien even, I don't care, some life form that is 1% beyond us
Right.
in DNA.
Where's that?
That we are beyond the chimp. The smartest of us. And they'll say, they'll roll Stephen Hawking forward and say, this one is slightly smarter than all the other humans because he can do astrophysics calculations in his head. Like little Timmy over here who just came home from alien preschool. Oh, Timmy, isn't that cute? Oh, you just derived principles of calculus. Isn't that nice? They put it on the refrigerator. Oh, you just composed a sonnet. Oh, that's so cute. Their simplest thoughts would be inconceivable to the most brilliant human beings at only 1% difference in DNA. Suppose we were 5%, 10%, 50%, 100%.